I remember the exact moment I stopped believing in fairy tales, and it wasn't when my father walked out or when I lost my first job. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was sitting in my Ford F-150 in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Burbank, staring at a text message from my wife that made my blood run cold. "Don't come home until after 7. I'm having the girls over for a thing." That was it. No emojis, no X's and O's, no pet name, just a command, and I remember thinking that's weird because she hated having people over on weekdays. She said it threw off her whole routine, made her feel like she was playing catch-up for the rest of the week. So why now? But I didn't question it. I was a good husband. That was my whole identity for 8 years. I was the reliable one, the one who showed up, who fixed the leaky faucet, who remembered to buy her favorite brand of almond milk even when it meant going to 3 different stores. I was the guy who drove her to her mother's house 3 states away when her dad had his stroke. The guy who sat in the waiting room for 14 hours without complaining. The guy who gave up his dream of opening his own garage to take a boring sales job so she could have health insurance. I was the guy who thought that if you just loved someone hard enough and consistently enough, they would love you back the same way. I was an idiot. Looking back, I can see all the red flags waving so violently they might as well have been on fire. The way she started going to the gym at 6 in the morning even though she'd always been a night owl. The way she changed her phone password and started taking it with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. The way she'd come home from happy hour with the girls smelling like a completely different cologne than the one I wore. The way she stopped talking about the future. We used to plan everything: vacations, renovations, kids' names. Then one day I realized we hadn't had a conversation about anything further than next week's grocery list in months, but I didn't want to see it. Denial is a hell of a drug, and I was mainlining it. My name is Jake, and I'm 34 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Pasadena that we bought at the peak of the market. The kind of house that looks like it belongs on a postcard with its big front porch and avocado tree. I work in medical device sales, which is exactly as soul-crushing as it sounds, but it pays the bills and then some. My wife, Emily, is 32. She's a graphic designer who works freelance, which meant she was always home when I got back, always had dinner started, always had some story to tell me about her day. That was what I fell in love with, her warmth. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world, like she was a sun and you were just lucky to be in her orbit. I spent 8 years orbiting that woman like she was the center of my universe. But that Tuesday in October, I did what she asked. I drove around aimlessly for a couple of hours. I went to a sports bar and nursed a beer while pretending to watch a game I didn't care about. I called my buddy Mark and listened to him bitch about his boss for 20 minutes. I even drove past our old apartment, the one we lived in when we first got married, the one with the broken dishwasher and the neighbor who played the drums at 2 in the morning. I sat there in the car and remembered how happy we were when we didn't have anything. How she'd make me pancakes at midnight and we'd eat them on the fire escape, laughing about how we were going to take over the world. Where did that girl go? When did she turn into someone who couldn't stand to be in the same room as me? I got home at 7:15, right on schedule. The house was quiet, too quiet, no music playing, no TV on, no sound of her talking on the phone. The kitchen was spotless, which was unusual because she always left her projects spread out on the island. I called her name and she answered from the bedroom. Her voice was strange, shaky. I walked down the hallway and found her sitting on the edge of our bed, fully dressed in jeans and a sweater, with her hands folded in her lap like she was about to receive a report card. "We need to talk," she said, those 4 words that have ended more relationships than infidelity itself. My stomach dropped into my feet. I knew right then that something was wrong, but I still didn't know how wrong. I sat down next to her, tried to take her hand, but she pulled away. It was like touching a hot stove. That was the first time she'd ever physically rejected me like that. I remember thinking, this is it, she's going to leave me, she's going to say she's not happy, she's going to ask for space. And I was ready to fight for it. I was ready to say I'd change, I'd do anything, I'd go to therapy, I'd quit my job, I'd sell the house, whatever it took. But what she said next made me realize I'd been fighting the wrong war. "I'm pregnant," she said, but she didn't sound happy. She sounded like she was confessing a crime, and for a second, just a split second, I felt this explosion of joy in my chest. We'd been trying for 3 years, we'd seen specialists. We'd done the ovulation tracking, the temperature taking, the weird positions, the expensive supplements. Nothing worked. We were about to start IVF, so this should have been the happiest moment of our lives, but I looked at her face and I didn't see happiness. I saw terror, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name at the time. I see it now. It was shame. I hugged her. I said it was amazing. I said I loved her. I started crying, honestly just relieved that we didn't have to go through all that medical stuff. And she just sat there, stiff as a board, not hugging me back, not saying anything. I pulled away and asked her what was wrong. She said nothing. She said she was just overwhelmed. She said she hadn't expected it to actually happen. She said she needed a minute, and I, being the idiot I was, gave her a minute. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of whiskey, something I rarely did, and I stood there staring at the wall, feeling like God had finally decided to throw me a bone. But that feeling didn't last. It couldn't, because over the next few weeks the cracks started becoming canyons. She wouldn't let me come to her doctor's appointments. She said she wanted to do it alone, that it was her body and she was nervous and needed to focus. I respected that because I'm a pushover. She started spending more time on her phone, typing furiously, and when I asked who she was talking to, she said it was a new client. She started going out more to clear her head and coming back with her hair messy and her cheeks flushed. I asked her once if there was someone else and she laughed in my face. She actually laughed. She said, "Jake, I'm pregnant with your baby. How could you even think that?" And I felt so guilty for asking that I almost apologized. That was the moment I should have trusted my gut over my heart. The first real sign that something was deeply wrong came when I found the ultrasound. Not in a sentimental way, not in a baby book or on the fridge. I found it crumpled up in the trash can in the bathroom, buried under a bunch of tissues and a box of tampons. It was dated 3 weeks earlier from a clinic I'd never heard of, in a town I didn't recognize. I fished it out, smoothed the wrinkles, and stared at the blurry black and white image of what was supposed to be my child. But the name on the top of the ultrasound wasn't Emily. It was a different name. I don't want to say it yet because saying it makes it real, but it was a man's name. A doctor's name. I told myself it must be a typo. The nurse must have put the wrong name, but my hands were shaking and my brain was screaming, and I think I already knew. I confronted her that night. I walked into the living room where she was watching some reality show about housewives, and I laid the ultrasound on the coffee table. I asked her who the man was. She turned white like she'd seen a ghost. She started stuttering, saying it was a mistake, saying it was a clerical error, saying I was being paranoid. But I kept pushing, I kept asking, and finally she broke. She started crying, not the kind of crying that comes from sadness, but the kind that comes from being caught. She put her hands over her face and said, "I didn't mean for this to happen." That sentence shattered me more than anything else, because it wasn't a denial. It was an admission. It was her telling me that she'd done something, but she wasn't sorry for doing it. She was sorry she'd gotten caught. I asked her who he was. She said his name was Ryan. She said he was a trainer at her gym. She said it had only been going on for a few months. She said it didn't mean anything. And I've heard all those cliches before, but hearing them from the woman you love, the woman you built a life with, the woman you're still trying to have a child with, it's like being stabbed with a dull knife. It doesn't just hurt, it tears. It leaves jagged edges that you can't put back together. I walked out of that room. I walked out of that house. I got in my truck and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just had to get away from her face, her voice, her words. I ended up at a park, the one where we used to walk our dog before we lost him to cancer 2 years ago. I sat on a bench in the dark and I screamed. I screamed until my throat burned. I cried so hard I almost threw up. I felt like someone had ripped my heart out of my chest and stomped on it in front of me. And the worst part was, even through all that anger, I still loved her. I still wanted to go back and hold her and tell her we could fix this. I still wanted to believe the baby was mine, but something in me had broken. Trust is like a mirror, you know. You can glue the pieces back together, but you'll always see the cracks. And I knew, sitting on that cold bench in that dark park, that I would never look at her the same way again. I would always wonder. I would always question. Every time she smiled at me, I'd wonder if she was thinking about him. Every time she touched me, I'd wonder if she was comparing me to him. And the baby, God, the baby. How was I supposed to raise a child that I wasn't even sure was mine? How was I supposed to look at its face every day and not see Ryan's eyes, Ryan's nose, Ryan's smile? I went home at midnight. I didn't say a word. I slept on the couch and I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning I went to work like nothing had happened. I put on a suit, I smiled at my colleagues, I closed a deal. I was a robot just going through the motions because the alternative was falling apart completely. And when I got home that night, she was waiting for me with dinner on the table. My favorite meal, pot roast. She was wearing my favorite dress. She tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. She started apologizing, saying it was the biggest mistake of her life, saying she loved me, saying she would do anything to make it right. She said she'd already broken it off with Ryan, that she hadn't seen him in weeks, that she wanted to be a family, and I wanted to believe her. God knows I wanted to believe her. But there was a nagging voice in the back of my head, the one I should have listened to all along. It said, if she can lie to you for months, if she can look you in the eye and tell you she loves you while she's sleeping with someone else, what makes you think she's telling the truth now? What makes you think she's ever going to tell you the truth again? I didn't know what to do, I still don't, but I do know that everything changed that night. Everything I thought I knew about love, about marriage, about trust, about myself, it all came crashing down, and I had a decision to make. I could either forgive her, live in the wreckage, and try to rebuild something that was never really stable to begin with, or I could walk away, burn it all down, and start over from nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I was still in love with her, and I hated myself for it. I wish I could tell you that I woke up the next morning with clarity, that I packed my bags and walked out with my head held high and my dignity intact. But that's not what happened. What happened was I stayed. I stayed because I was scared. I stayed because the thought of dividing our assets, of telling our families, of explaining to my friends that my wife had been cheating on me with a gym trainer named Ryan who probably had abs you could grate cheese on, it made me feel physically ill. I stayed because I still loved her, or at least I loved the ghost of who she used to be, and I kept telling myself that if I just tried hard enough, I could resurrect her. I could bring her back from wherever she'd gone. So we went to therapy. Dr. Linda was a middle-aged woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a soothing voice that made you feel like you were being gently lowered into a warm bath. She specialized in infidelity recovery. I found her on Google after 3 sleepless nights of scrolling through forums and articles and desperate Reddit threads where strangers told each other to leave and never look back. I ignored all of them. I thought I was different. I thought our love was special. I thought we could beat the statistics. Dr. Linda looked at us across her beige office with its sad ficus tree and its box of tissues strategically placed on the coffee table, and she said the word that would become my new least favorite word in the English language. Rebuilding. Rebuilding. What a joke. How do you rebuild something when you don't even know what the original structure looked like anymore? Because I was starting to realize that the Emily I married might not have ever really existed. That the woman who laughed at my dumb jokes and held my hand during horror movies and cried when I surprised her with tickets to Paris for our 5th anniversary might have just been a really, really good performance. And that thought was worse than the cheating. The cheating was a wound. The realization that I'd been in love with a character was a complete amputation. Therapy sessions were brutal. Dr. Linda made us do this exercise where we had to share one thing we appreciated about each other every day. Emily would say something generic like, "I appreciate that Jake always takes out the trash," and I would sit there fuming thinking, "You appreciate that I take out the trash. I just found out you've been sleeping with another man for months and you appreciate my contribution to waste management." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the coffee table and walk out and never come back, but I didn't. I sat there like a good little husband and I said, "I appreciate that Emily makes me laugh even though I hadn't genuinely laughed in weeks. Every smile was forced. Every kiss was a lie. Every time she touched my arm, I felt a jolt of revulsion followed immediately by a wave of shame for feeling that way about my own wife." Meanwhile, the baby was growing, and I mean that literally and metaphorically. It was a ticking clock. Every day that passed, Emily's belly got a little bit rounder and the question got a little bit louder in my head. Is it mine? Is it his? I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling and doing the math over and over again like a crazy person. I'd trace back through my calendar, counting weeks, counting days, remembering the nights we were intimate and comparing them to the nights she was working late or at the gym. It didn't add up. I couldn't make it add up. There was a 4-week window where she'd been distant and cold and had given me every excuse in the book to avoid intimacy, and that window lined up perfectly with the estimated conception date. I knew because I'd stolen her phone one night while she was asleep and gone through her period tracker app. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, and I hated every second of it. I didn't tell Dr. Linda about that part. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat there in those beige chairs and nodded along while Emily talked about how she'd felt neglected, how I'd been working too much, how she'd needed attention and validation and Ryan had just been there. I wanted to scream that I was working too much so she could have the lifestyle she wanted. I wanted to scream that I was working too much because I was trying to provide for the family she kept saying she wanted. But I swallowed it all down because that's what men do, right? We swallow our anger and our pain and our humiliation and we turn it into something productive. We build decks, we fix cars, we go to the gym and lift heavy things until our muscles burn and our minds go blank. That's what I did. I channeled all of it into physical exhaustion. I ran until my knees ached. I lifted weights until I couldn't lift my arms. I did everything I could to numb the part of my brain that kept replaying the mental image of Emily with Ryan, of his hands on her, of her laughing at his jokes the way she used to laugh at mine. But the numbness never lasted. It always wore off, usually around 3 a.m. when the house was silent and I could hear her breathing in the bedroom while I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling fan. And that's when the anger would come back. Not the hot, explosive anger that makes you want to break things. It was a cold anger, a quiet, simmering rage that sat in my chest like a stone. I started looking at her differently. I'd watch her brush her hair in the morning and I'd think, who is this woman? What is she really thinking right now? Is she thinking about him? Is she texting him when I'm at work? Is she planning to leave me once the baby is born and she gets child support? These thoughts consumed me. They ate away at any progress we were supposedly making in therapy. And then one night I found the picture. It was on her laptop, which she'd left open on the kitchen counter while she went to take a shower. I wasn't snooping, not really. I was just putting a glass in the sink and I saw the screen lit up and something drew me to it. It was a Facebook message thread, not with Ryan, with her best friend, a woman named Rachel, who I'd always been a little suspicious of because she had a habit of laughing too hard at Emily's jokes and encouraging her to be reckless. I scrolled up a little, just a little, and I saw a message that said he doesn't suspect anything, right? And Emily had replied, no, he's so clueless. He thinks we're actually working on it. It's almost sad. And then there was a string of laughing emojis. My blood turned to ice. I read the whole conversation. I read about how Emily had been planning to leave me for months, how she was just waiting for the right moment, how she'd been saving money in a secret account, how she had already picked out an apartment near her mother's house. I read about how the baby was definitely Ryan's, and how they were going to raise it together, and how I was just a placeholder until she got everything she wanted out of me. I read about how she was using the therapy to build a paper trail of trying so that when she finally filed for divorce, it would look like she gave it her best effort and I was the one who couldn't forgive her. And I read about how she didn't love me anymore. She'd never loved me, she said. She'd married me because I was stable and safe and boring, and she'd stayed because it was comfortable, but she'd always been looking for something more. I felt like I was going to throw up. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the screen, and I felt the entire foundation of my life crack and crumble into dust. Everything I thought I knew, every memory I had, every moment I treasured, it was all a lie. My marriage was a scam. My wife was a fraud. And I was the biggest fool in the history of fools because I had let it go on for so long, because I had let her gaslight me and manipulate me and make me feel like the crazy one. I closed the laptop, walked upstairs, and stood in the doorway of the bathroom while she was in the shower. I could see her silhouette through the frosted glass, and for a second I felt nothing but hatred. Pure, unadulterated hatred for this woman who had made a fool out of me for years. But I didn't confront her, not then. I walked away, got in my truck, and drove to a bar downtown where nobody knew my name. I sat on a stool and ordered whiskey after whiskey and thought about what I was going to do. I had options. I could confront her, throw her out, and file for divorce immediately. I could expose her to everyone we knew, to her family, to her friends, to her clients. I could make her life a living hell, but something stopped me. Something in my gut told me to be patient, to play the long game, to let her think she was getting away with it. Because if there's one thing I'd learned from all of this, it's that the best revenge is not the loud, messy, dramatic kind. It's the quiet, calculated, and devastating kind. So I went home that night, crawled back onto the couch, and waited. I waited for the right moment. I went to therapy and smiled and nodded. I let Emily think everything was getting better. I told her I was ready to forgive her, that I was ready to move forward. I watched her face light up with relief, and I felt a sick satisfaction knowing that it was all a performance, just like hers had been. I had become an actor in my own life, playing the role of the forgiving husband while she played the role of the reformed wife. It was exhausting, but it was also strangely empowering. For the first time in months, I had control, not over her, not over the situation, but over myself. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a survivor, and I was going to make sure she regretted every single lie she'd ever told me. The next few weeks were a masterclass in deception. I'd never been good at lying, but I learned fast. I'd come home with flowers and she'd smile and kiss me and I'd feel nothing. I'd take her to dinner and she'd hold my hand across the table and I'd think about that Facebook message. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. Dates, times, conversations. I gathered evidence like a detective building a case. I hired a private investigator, a guy named Frank who looked like he'd been in this business since before I was born. He had a gravelly voice and a cheap suit and a confidence that made me feel like I was finally taking this seriously. I gave him Ryan's name and her secret apartment address, and I let him do the rest. Frank came back with photos and videos that made my stomach churn. Emily meeting Ryan at a coffee shop, Emily getting into his car, Emily laughing with her head thrown back in a way she hadn't laughed with me in years. There was one picture of them kissing outside her secret apartment building, and I stared at it for a solid hour, trying to find any trace of guilt in her expression. There was none. She looked happy. She looked free. She looked like a woman who had never been married to a man she despised. That was the picture that broke me, not the cheating, not the lies, not the pregnancy. It was the happiness. The fact that she could be so happy with someone else while I was drowning in misery. That was the part I couldn't forgive. I knew I had to act. I couldn't keep pretending forever, but I also knew I had to be smart. I couldn't just kick her out and file for divorce because she was pregnant, and no judge in California was going to look favorably on a man who kicked out his pregnant wife. I needed her to leave on her own. I needed her to think it was her idea, so I started subtly pushing her away. I started working later. I stopped initiating conversations. I stopped being affectionate. I let the silence stretch between us until it was unbearable. She noticed, of course. She asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine. She asked if I was still upset about the affair, and I said I was trying to move past it. She asked if I still loved her, and I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Of course I do," with a smile so practiced it could have won an Oscar. But inside, I was planning. I had already spoken to a divorce attorney, a shark of a woman named Margaret who didn't blink when I told her the whole story. She laid out my options like a chess player planning her next move. She told me I had a strong case for alienation of affection, even though California is a no-fault state. She told me that if I could prove paternity fraud, I could potentially avoid child support. She told me to document everything, to save every text, every email, every piece of evidence. And most importantly, she told me to wait until the baby was born. Because once the baby was here, we could do a paternity test and the truth would be undeniable. I just had to survive the next 3 months. 3 months. It felt like a lifetime. Every day was a performance. Every meal was a charade. Every night was a battle to keep from screaming. I'd lie in bed next to her, listening to her breathe, and I'd think about all the things I wanted to say, all the things I wanted to do. But I stayed silent because I knew that patience was the only weapon I had left. I knew that if I blew up too soon, I'd lose any chance of coming out of this with my dignity intact. So I played the part. I was the supportive husband. I went to every doctor's appointment and smiled at every ultrasound. I painted the nursery and assembled the crib and bought the tiny clothes and pretended I was excited. And all the while, Emily was getting more and more comfortable. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd fooled me into staying. She stopped being careful with her phone, stopped sneaking around. She'd take calls in the other room and I'd hear her laughing, using that same tone she used to use with me. She started staying out late again, claiming she was going to prenatal yoga or baby classes. I knew she was with him, but I didn't say a word. I let her think she was getting away with it. I let her build a fantasy where she could have it all: the stable husband at home, the exciting lover on the side, the perfect little family she'd always wanted. She had no idea that I was building a fantasy too. My fantasy was her downfall, and then the baby came. It was a girl, 6 pounds and 11 ounces, with a tuft of dark hair and a cry that could wake the dead. I held her in my arms in the hospital room and I looked at her face and I felt nothing. Not love, not anger, not sadness, just a void, because I didn't know if she was mine. I looked at Emily, exhausted but glowing, and I saw her watching me with a calculating look. She was waiting to see how I'd react. She was trying to gauge whether I'd fallen for the act, and I smiled because I knew what was coming next. I'd already arranged it, the paternity test. It was going to be done discreetly without Emily's knowledge. I'd had it set up weeks in advance, a simple cheek swab that would be sent to a lab for analysis. I just needed a few hours alone with the baby. I made up an excuse about needing to take her for some extra testing, something routine, nothing to worry about. Emily was too tired to argue. She nodded off and I took her daughter, I should say, to the lab and had the sample collected. Then I went home, sat in the nursery and waited for the results. I'd never been so scared in my entire life. Not when I lost my job, not when my dad died, not even when I found that Facebook message. This was different. This was the moment of truth. If the baby was mine, then I had a daughter, a real daughter, and I had to figure out how to be a father in the middle of this disaster. If the baby wasn't mine, then I had no ties to this woman anymore. No reason to stay, no reason to forgive, no reason to pretend. The results came back in 3 days. I opened the email in my truck, in the same Home Depot parking lot where this whole nightmare had started to unravel, and I read the words that changed everything. The baby was not mine. I stared at that email for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to process them. I read them over and over again, like a foreign language I was desperately trying to translate. Probability of paternity 0.00%. That's what it said. Clean, clinical, absolute. There was no gray area, no maybe, no room for doubt. That baby, the one I'd held in my arms, the one I'd painted a nursery for, the one I'd spent sleepless nights worrying about, she wasn't mine. She was his, Ryan's. The gym trainer with the perfect teeth and the easy smile and the life that didn't include a mortgage or a boring sales job or a wife he was trying to forgive. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember parking the truck or walking through the front door. I just remember standing in the kitchen, still holding my phone in my hand, and looking at Emily sitting at the island with a cup of tea and a baby monitor on the counter. She looked up at me and smiled, that same fake smile she'd been giving me for months, and she said, "Hey babe, how was your day?" And something inside me snapped. Not the loud, violent snap that makes you throw things or break walls. It was a quiet snap, the kind that happens deep in your bones, the kind that changes you forever. I didn't say anything. I just walked over to the island, placed my phone face up in front of her, and waited. She looked down, read the email, and I watched the color drain from her face. It was like watching a balloon deflate. Her shoulders dropped, her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her, almost. Then she started talking, and all that sympathy evaporated like water on a hot sidewalk. "Jake, I can explain," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think. There's been a mistake. The lab made a mistake. That's impossible. I don't know how that happened." And I just stood there listening to her dig herself deeper, and I felt a strange sense of calm because I'd already seen this movie. I'd already watched her lie to me 100 times, and I knew all her tells: the way she touched her hair, the way she blinked too fast, the way she couldn't look me in the eye for more than a second. She was lying, and she knew I knew she was lying, but she couldn't stop herself. It was like watching someone drown in a puddle. "It's not a mistake, Emily," I said, and my voice was so steady it surprised me. "I had the test done at a certified lab. I watched them collect the sample. There's no mistake." She started crying then, big ugly tears that smeared her mascara and made her nose run. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. She begged me to sit down, to talk, to let her explain. She said she loved me. She said she was sorry. She said all the things she should have said months ago, but it was too late. It had been too late the moment she decided to climb into bed with another man and pretend our marriage meant nothing. I walked away from her. I walked upstairs into the nursery, and I looked at the crib I'd assembled with my own hands, the mobile I'd hung, the little stuffed animals I'd arranged on the shelf, the name we'd picked out together, a name I'd loved because it sounded strong and beautiful and full of promise. None of it meant anything anymore. It was all just props in a play where I was the unwitting lead. I picked up a onesie from the dresser, a tiny pink thing with little elephants on it, and I held it in my hands, and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. That baby wasn't mine. She never was, and I had spent months preparing for a life that was never going to happen. I heard Emily come up the stairs behind me. She stood in the doorway, sniffling, and she said, "Jake, please, please don't walk away from me. We can get through this. We can figure this out." I turned around and looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw her for who she was. Not the woman I'd married, not the woman I'd loved, not the woman I'd tried to save. I saw a selfish, manipulative, broken person who would say anything to get what she wanted. And what she wanted was to keep me around, to keep the house, to keep the stability, to keep the free childcare while she ran off with her trainer. I saw through it all, and for the first time I wasn't angry. I was just done. I told her I was leaving. I told her I was going to stay at a hotel for a few days, and I needed her to respect my space. She begged me not to go. She said it would be bad for the baby. The baby. I laughed at that. I actually laughed out loud. I said, "What baby? Your baby, not mine. I've got zero legal responsibility here." And the look on her face was priceless. It was the look of a woman who had just realized her safety net had been cut. She started screaming then, calling me names, saying I was heartless, saying I was abandoning her in her time of need. She said I was a monster for not loving that baby like she was my own. And I just walked out because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I checked into a Marriott near the airport, the kind of place that smells like cleaning products and despair. I got a room on the 4th floor, ordered a pizza I didn't eat, and sat on the bed staring at the wall. I felt like I was in a movie, a really bad one where the protagonist loses everything in the first act and spends the rest of the film trying to get it back. But I wasn't going to get it back. There was nothing to get back. My marriage was a corpse, and I was just waiting for someone to call the time of death. The next few days were a blur. I ignored Emily's calls and texts. She left voicemails that alternated between angry, desperate, and pleading. One minute she'd be screaming that I was a coward, the next she'd be sobbing that she couldn't do this without me. I didn't respond to any of them. I just let them pile up, a digital monument to her desperation. And then the texts started coming from other people. Her mother, who called me a bastard for abandoning her daughter. Her best friend Rachel, who told me I was overreacting and that everyone makes mistakes. Even my own mother called, and I had to tell her the whole sordid story, which was the hardest conversation I've ever had. My mom is a saint, a woman who raised me on her own after my dad left, and hearing the disappointment in her voice was worse than any of the stuff Emily had said. But my mom surprised me. She didn't tell me to go back or to work it out. She told me she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She told me I deserved better. And then she said something that stuck with me. "Jake, sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their choices." That hit me hard because I'd spent so much of my life trying to fix things for Emily, to make her life easier, to protect her from herself. And where had that gotten me? It had gotten me a house full of lies and a baby that wasn't mine. I decided I was going to file for divorce. I called Margaret, my attorney, and told her to start the paperwork. I told her I wanted it done fast and I wanted it done clean. I wasn't going to fight over the house or the furniture or the retirement account. I just wanted out. I wanted to wash my hands of the whole mess and start over somewhere far away from Pasadena. But I wasn't going to let Emily off easy. I had all the evidence. The Facebook messages, the photos from Frank, the paternity test. I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because I was tired of being the one who swallowed the lies. I was tired of being the bigger person. I was tired of protecting her reputation while she destroyed my life, so I made a decision. I was going to tell her parents myself, not in anger, not in a fit of rage, but calmly and rationally. They deserved to know who their daughter really was. I drove to their house in Orange County, a sprawling suburban mansion with a perfect lawn and a pristine pool. Emily's father opened the door, and I could tell by the look on his face that he'd already heard some version of the story. He ushered me inside, called for his wife, and we sat down in their living room with its white couches and its framed family photos, and I told them everything. I told them about the affair, about the paternity test, about the secret apartment, about the Facebook messages. I didn't hold anything back. Emily's mom started crying. Her dad sat there with a stony expression, his jaw tight, and he just listened. When I was done, he didn't say a word. He just nodded, stood up, and walked out of the room. I found out later that he'd gone into his study and called Emily, and he'd told her that if she didn't come clean about everything, he was cutting her off. No more money, no more support, no more safety net. She was on her own. And that was the moment everything started to unravel for her. Because without her parents' money, without my income, without the house and the car and the insurance, she was just a woman with a baby and a lover who couldn't support her. And Ryan, the great love of her life, turned out to be a coward. He left her. I found out through Frank, who was still keeping tabs on her. Ryan had apparently told Emily that he wasn't ready to be a father, that he didn't sign up for this, that she needed to figure things out on her own. He moved out of his apartment and disappeared. I honestly didn't care. It was just more confirmation of what I already knew. Emily had burned her entire life to the ground for a man who couldn't even commit to a gym membership. And now she was alone, broke, and stuck with a baby she couldn't afford. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. I'd spent 8 years loving her, and that kind of love doesn't just evaporate overnight. But every time I felt a pang of sympathy, I would remember the pictures, the texts, the lies. I would remember the way she had laughed about me with Rachel, called me clueless, made me the punchline of her joke. I would remember the way she had planned to leave me long before I ever found out the truth. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a perpetrator, and she had made her bed. The divorce was finalized in record time. Margaret did a phenomenal job. I walked away with the house, the truck, and my 401k. Emily got a small settlement and a shared custody arrangement that I knew she'd never use because she was already planning to move back in with her parents. I didn't fight her on the baby. I had no legal claim to her, and I had no emotional claim either. That sounds cold, I know, but it's the truth. I couldn't raise a child that wasn't mine, not when every time I looked at her I would see Ryan's eyes, Ryan's smile, Ryan's betrayal. It wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to me. I had to let go. The day the divorce papers were signed, I sat in my truck in that same Home Depot parking lot and I cried. Not for Emily, not for the marriage, but for the life I thought I was going to have. The kids I'd imagined, the vacations we'd planned, the retirement we dreamed of. It was all gone, swept away by a series of choices Emily had made without ever considering the consequences. And I realized that I couldn't blame her for all of it. I had to take some responsibility too. I had let myself be a doormat. I had ignored the red flags. I had convinced myself that love was enough, that if I just kept trying, everything would work out. It was a harsh lesson, but it was the most important one I'd ever learned. I started going to therapy again, but this time it was just for me. I talked about my childhood, about my absent father, about why I had chosen a partner who mirrored his emotional unavailability. I talked about my fear of being alone, my need to be needed, my habit of sacrificing myself for people who wouldn't do the same for me. It was painful, but it was necessary. And slowly, very slowly, I started to feel like myself again. Not the old Jake, the one who was so eager to please, but a new Jake. A Jake who knew his worth, a Jake who wasn't afraid to walk away. I sold the house 6 months later, too many memories. I moved to a smaller place in Silver Lake, a trendy neighborhood with hipster coffee shops and vintage stores and an energy that felt more like me. I kept the truck. I bought a dog, a golden retriever puppy I named Scout. He was a mess, chewing everything and peeing on the floor, but he was the best decision I ever made. He reminded me that life could be simple, that joy could be found in the smallest things, that love didn't have to be complicated. And then, about a year after the divorce, I ran into Emily at a grocery store. It was a cold December evening, and I was picking up ingredients for a chili I was going to make for a small gathering of friends. I turned the corner, and there she was, pushing a cart with her daughter strapped into the seat. She looked tired, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes and a weariness in her posture that hadn't been there before. She saw me, and for a second I saw a flash of the old Emily, the one who used to light up when she saw me. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by something more guarded, more careful. We stood there in the frozen food aisle, two strangers who had once promised to love each other forever. She said my name and I said hers, and we both just stood there awkwardly. She asked how I was doing and I gave her the standard answer. Fine, good, busy. She told me she'd moved back to her parents' house. She told me she was working part-time at a local design firm. She told me Ryan wasn't in the picture anymore. I didn't ask why, I didn't care. She looked at my face, searching for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe pity, maybe a sign that I still had feelings for her. But I truly didn't feel anything, just a vague sense of sadness for the person she used to be. We said goodbye and I walked away. I didn't look back, I didn't have to, because I had finally moved on. The betrayal that had once consumed me was now just a chapter in my past, one I'd written and closed and put on a shelf. And I knew with a certainty that surprised me that I was going to be okay. I was better than okay. I was free. Free from the lies, free from the manipulation, free from the endless cycle of trying to fix something that was never really mine to fix. I got home, cooked my chili, and spent the night with my dog and my friends, laughing and eating and drinking. It wasn't a wild party, not some cinematic moment of triumph. It was just life, ordinary and beautiful and completely mine. And as I sat there on my couch watching Scout chase his tail, I realized that the best revenge wasn't making her suffer or making her regret what she'd done. It was living well. It was finding happiness again. It was proving to myself and to everyone else that I didn't need her to be whole. I just needed me. But the story wasn't quite over. There was one more piece I hadn't accounted for, one more person who was about to walk into my life and change everything I thought I knew about love and trust and second chances. And I wasn't ready for it, not even close. I thought I was done with surprises. I thought I'd weathered the storm, survived the wreckage, and earned my peaceful little harbor in Silver Lake. I had my routine, my dog, my small circle of friends who knew the whole ugly story and didn't judge me for it. I went to work, I came home, I took Scout to the dog park, I cooked dinner, I watched stupid shows on Netflix. It was simple, it was safe. It was exactly what I needed after a year of emotional warfare. But life, as I'd learned the hard way, doesn't give a damn about what you think you need. Her name was Chloe, and I met her at the dog park of all places. She had a rescue mutt named Pickle, a scruffy little thing with one floppy ear and a personality the size of Texas. She was there every Saturday morning, same as me, and we'd nod at each other from across the gravel path while our dogs did their business and sniffed each other's butts. I didn't think much of her at first. She was pretty sure, with dark curly hair and freckles and a laugh that was more of a snort, but I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't even looking in the direction of anything. I was still nursing the wounds Emily had left, still flinching at the thought of being vulnerable with someone new. But Chloe was persistent in a gentle way. She started small, asking me about Scout's breed, then offering dog-sitting tips. Then one day she just parked herself on the bench next to mine and started talking, and I couldn't stop listening. She was a pediatric nurse, which explained the endless patience she had for both Pickle and the chaotic world of dog park politics. She was funny, not in a performative way, but in the way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room when she's telling a story. She had this way of looking at you like she genuinely wanted to know what was going on inside your head. It was disarming, and I hated it. I hated it because it made me want to tell her everything, and I'd spent the last year teaching myself to keep everything locked up tight. For weeks, I kept her at arm's length. I'd talk to her at the park, but I'd always find an excuse to leave early. I'd laugh at her jokes, but I wouldn't share anything real. I'd smile and nod and keep my heart in a vault. And then one day, she called me out on it. We were sitting on that bench, watching Scout and Pickle chase each other in circles, and she turned to me with this expression that was equal parts curiosity and frustration. She said, "Jake, I like you, I think you're a good guy, but you've got walls so high I'd need a ladder and a grappling hook to get over them, and I'm not trying to climb them, I'm just trying to be your friend, so maybe dial it back a notch." Yeah, I laughed. I didn't mean to, but it came out of me, this raw, unguarded laugh that I hadn't heard in over a year. And I realized I wanted to trust her. I wanted to tell her the truth about who I was and what I'd been through, so I did. I told her everything: the cheating, the pregnancy, the paternity test, the divorce. I told her about Emily, about Ryan, about the wasted years. I told her about the therapy, the anger, the sleepless nights, and she listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She just sat there with her hand resting on my arm, and she let me unload the weight I'd been carrying for so long. When I was done, I expected her to run. That's what people do, right? They hear the messy, complicated truth about someone and they decide it's too much. But Chloe didn't run. She squeezed my arm and said, "That sounds really hard. I'm sorry you went through that." And then she changed the subject and started telling me a story about how Pickle had eaten an entire loaf of sourdough bread off her counter and spent the next 3 days having the most spectacular gas of his life. I laughed so hard I almost fell off the bench. And in that moment I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let someone in again. But letting Chloe in wasn't a straight line. It was a series of small steps and occasional stumbles, because healing isn't linear and I had more scars than I wanted to admit. The first time we went on an actual date, I couldn't stop checking my phone, not because I was expecting a call, but because I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I kept waiting for her to reveal some hidden agenda, some secret betrayal, some sign that she was just like Emily. It didn't happen. She was exactly who she said she was, and that scared me more than anything else. The first time we slept together, I woke up in a cold sweat at 3 a.m, convinced I'd made a mistake. I lay there in the dark, staring at her sleeping face, and I felt this overwhelming urge to run. Not because of anything she'd done, but because of what she represented. She represented hope, and hope was terrifying. Because hope meant I could be hurt again, hope meant I could lose everything again, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to survive another loss. But I didn't run, I stayed. I stayed because Chloe was worth it. I stayed because she was patient with my anxiety and understanding of my triggers and never once made me feel like I was broken. She didn't try to fix me, she just held space for me to figure things out on my own. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, I started to trust again. Months passed. Scout and Pickle became inseparable, which meant Chloe and I were spending more and more time together. She started leaving things at my apartment: a toothbrush, a spare set of scrubs, a mug with a dumb pun on it that she insisted was the best gift she'd ever given anyone. I found myself looking forward to the little texts she'd send during the day, the random photos of Pickle doing something ridiculous, the voice notes that always made me smile. I was falling for her. And it scared the hell out of me because I knew I was risking everything all over again. I thought about telling her I loved her about 100 times before I actually did it. I'd rehearse it in my head, come up with the perfect words, and then chicken out at the last second. I was terrified of being vulnerable, terrified of being rejected, terrified of repeating the same mistakes. But one night, after a particularly good dinner at a little Italian place she'd found, I just looked at her across the table and the words came out before I could stop them. "I love you, Chloe." And she smiled, not a triumphant smile, not a smug smile, but a soft, genuine smile that made her freckles crinkle. And she said, "I know, I love you too, you big idiot." I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. The weight that had been pressing on my chest since the day I found that Facebook message finally lifted. I wasn't fixed, not by a long shot, but I was healing. And I had someone who was willing to walk beside me while I did it. That was more than I ever thought I'd have again. But the past has a way of creeping back into your life when you least expect it. And a few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten, which was strange because nobody writes letters anymore. It was from Emily. My stomach dropped as I opened it, but I told myself I was strong enough to handle whatever she had to say. And what she had to say was a bombshell. She wrote that she was sorry. Not the kind of sorry that comes with excuses or justifications, but a real, desperate, ugly apology. She told me she'd been in therapy, really committed this time, and she'd finally started to understand the damage she'd done. She told me she didn't expect my forgiveness, but she wanted me to know that she was trying to become a better person. She told me about her daughter, how she was growing up fast, how she looked nothing like Emily and everything like Ryan, which was a constant reminder of the biggest mistake of her life. And then she told me the reason she was writing. She had been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. I read that part 3 times, waiting for it to sink in. Emily, the woman who had destroyed my life, was fighting for hers. She was scared. She was alone because Ryan was long gone and her parents were aging and her friends had all drifted away. She told me she'd been thinking about the past a lot, about all the things she wished she'd done differently. She said she wasn't reaching out for help just for closure. She wanted me to know that she was sorry, truly sorry, and that she would spend the rest of her life, however long that was, trying to be the person she should have been all along. I sat there on my couch, holding that letter, and I felt a swirl of emotions I couldn't untangle. Anger, because it felt manipulative even now, like she was trying to guilt me into something. Sadness, because despite everything, the thought of her suffering made my chest ache. Confusion, because I didn't know how to process any of it. And then there was this weird, unexpected feeling of pity. Not the condescending kind, but the kind that comes when you realize someone is just as broken and lost as you were. I showed the letter to Chloe that night. I didn't want to keep secrets, not anymore. She read it slowly, her face unreadable, and when she finished, she looked at me with those big brown eyes and said, "What do you want to do?" I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted to burn the letter and pretend I'd never seen it. Part of me wanted to call Emily and yell at her for dragging me back into her drama. And part of me, the part I hated the most, wanted to reach out. Not because I still loved her, because I didn't, but because she was a human being and she was scared, and I knew what it felt like to be completely alone in the dark. I didn't decide right away. I sat with it for a few days, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I talked to my therapist about it, and she told me that forgiveness wasn't for Emily, it was for me. It was about letting go of the anger and the bitterness so they didn't poison the good things I was building with Chloe. She told me I didn't have to reconcile with Emily or become her friend, but I could choose to release her from the debt she owed me, not for her sake but for mine. So I wrote her back, a short, simple letter. I told her I forgave her. Not because she deserved it, but because I was tired of carrying the weight of what she'd done. I told her I wished her well in her treatment and that I hoped she found peace. And then I closed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and mailed it into the void. I never heard back from her, and honestly I didn't want to. That chapter of my life was closed, and I was finally, genuinely okay with that. But there was one more thing I hadn't accounted for. One more twist in the road that would test everything I thought I knew about love and trust. I found out about it on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the waiting room of Chloe's clinic. She had called me in a panic, her voice shaky and her words coming out all jumbled. She said she needed me to come, that something had happened that she couldn't explain over the phone. I drove as fast as I could, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. I was sure she was sick or hurt or something equally catastrophic. When I got there, she was sitting in the corner of the break room, still in her scrubs, her face pale and her hands trembling. She had a piece of paper in her hand and she was staring at it like it was a bomb. I sat down next to her, took her hand, and asked her what was going on. She didn't say anything, she just handed me the paper. It was a letter typed and formal from a lawyer. And as I read it, the world tilted on its axis. The letter was about a child that Chloe had given up for adoption when she was 19, long before we ever met. A child that had just turned 18 and had hired a private investigator to find her birth mother. And that child, according to the letter, was coming to Los Angeles. She wanted to meet Chloe. She wanted to know where she came from. And Chloe, who had never told a single soul about this part of her past, was terrified. Terrified of what the girl would think of her, terrified of opening old wounds, terrified of bringing another complicated person into our lives. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I wanted to, but I didn't know how. I was scared you'd think I was a monster." I held her hand and I didn't let go, because I knew better than anyone that the past has a way of catching up with you, and I also knew that the people we love are never just their mistakes. They're the whole messy, complicated sum of everything they've done and everything they've survived. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know if this girl would be a blessing or a disaster. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my choices. I was going to stand by Chloe the same way she'd stood by me, and we were going to figure it out together. That's what love is, I think. Not the fairy tale, not the perfect ending, not the absence of pain. It's showing up even when it's hard. It's choosing someone even when you're scared. It's building something new out of the wreckage, brick by brick, and trusting that it will hold. I learned that lesson the hard way, through betrayal and heartbreak and loss, but I learned it. And now, sitting in that break room with Chloe's hand in mine, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it, because I was no longer the man who had been betrayed. I was the man who had survived, and that made all the difference.
কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কার নিয়ে চলো? আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো? কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কার নিয়ে চলো? আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো? কার মনেতে তোমার আশা রাখো জমা করে? আমার আশা পুইরা দিয়া তুমি রইলা দূরে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই। তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই। তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। আসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশা গুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। বাসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশা গুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। তোর প্রেমেরই মন্ত্র ছিল অভিনয়ের জাল, তোর কথা বিশ্বাস কইরা হইল আমার কাল। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই। তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই। তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে, কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। স্বার্থ নিয়া করলে খেলায় আমার সাথে রে, পর ভাবিয়া দূরে গেলে আমায় রেখে রে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে সদো নারী সুই। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে